Hi, this is Mashnu, and I've been looking at the game that you sent me. It's a very interesting game. You write in the message that you sent me that you played this game with a thinking time of 45 minutes for each player. It was on the internet, the free internet chess server, also known as X. And that's a great place to play, by the way. And 45 minutes for each player gives you enough time to play a serious game, and well, the game don't last too long. Now, the other side of the coin is, of course, what you write also, that in the end you got in time trouble and you made some mistakes because of that. Also, you write me that you had some trouble visualizing variations and calculating counting moves, calculating variations, and that's something, of course, that's a very common difficulty in chess, for actually for all levels, is to calculate accurately. There are some exercises for that, but first I want to have a good look at the game and comment it, and then I'm going to give you some ideas to calculate more accurately. Let's see, your opponent opened with d4, and by the way, your opponent, I see here on the ELO ratings that your opponent was higher rated than you, more than 200 points higher, so this was a big challenge to play against him, I guess. You answer with d5, and he plays the queen's gambit with c4. You decline the gambit with e6. He plays knight to c3, and here you continue with c5. The so-called Tarrasch setup, d5 and c5 against the queen's gambit. He plays e3. You go knight to f6, developing your knight, and he plays knight f3. And here you continue with bishop to e7. By the way, the most played move in this position is knight to c6, developing the knight and waiting a bit with the development of this bishop. In case white wants to take on c5, then you don't lose a tempo retaking on c5. But well, bishop to e7, it has also been played on grandmaster level. It's not a bad move. Just delaying this this bishop move is also something that is seen quite a lot. Your opponent also here places bishop from f1 to d3, and you continue with knight to c6, and here he plays a3. Now, he plays a3. When I saw this move, I thought, okay, perhaps what he wants to do is to play queen to c2 and not be worried about knight to b4, forking the queen and the bishop. That could be an idea, a plan for white. Also, a3 can later support the move b4. Let's say that these two pawns are traded later, and perhaps also these two pawns are traded. Then a move like b4 can be very handy to place the bishop on b2. This diagonal will be open. So those are possible ideas behind a3. You continued here with castling kingside. He castles kingside, and now I actually had expected something like b6 followed by bishop to b7, because this bishop, this light square bishop that you have, is actually at the moment, let's say, a problem child. Yeah, there is not really a good way to develop this bishop because of this pawn on e6, and only if white would take on d5 and we retake with the pawn, then the bishop could be developed, but we cannot wait that long. So that's why I thought perhaps b6 would be a good idea here. White, I'm sorry, could do the same, play b3 here and then bishop to b7, and plays bishop to b2, and this bishop on b7, at first sight it looks as if it's very passive because it's looking at its own pawn, but actually you can choose the moment, the right moment, to eventually take on c4, so then this bishop has a big scope there. Another option, let's go back here, another option here would be to play c takes d4. After white retakes, then play d takes c4. White retakes, and then the d4 pawn is well defended by the queen and the knight. And here we could continue with a6 with the same idea of advancing b5 and then playing bishop to b7. That's actually the way of developing that you would need with black to look for in this type of positions. Open the center, isolate the queen's pawn of white, and then placing your bishop on b7. Why on b7? Well, because the bishop on b7 will be controlling the d5 square. And the d5 square is very important because what white wants to do with this isolated queen's pawn is at a certain point to advance his pawn and then trade it so he gets an open center and doesn't have any problem with this eventually weak pawn on the d file. Well, that's just, let's say, one of the possibilities to play against this isolated queen's pawn. In the Tarrasch variation of the Queen's Gambit, we often get this theme of isolated queen's pawn. Sometimes also it's black that has to play with an isolated queen's pawn. If white takes on d5 and will retake with the pawn and then trade on c5, we have the same idea with reversed colors. Now, the isolated queen's pawn is not something that's always bad or always good. There are really a huge amount of books written only about this isolated queen's pawn idea. Some people like to play with an isolated queen's pawn, some other people like to play against it. So there is no absolute truth about that. Well, what you played in this position, you played rook to e8. Rook to e8 prepares eventually later advancing this e pawn, so it has a plan. At the moment perhaps it's a bit slow, but there is no, it's not a bad move at all. Your opponent plays a rook to e1, and now you play the move a6. Controlling b5, perhaps your idea was to play queen to c7 at some point without being worried about this knight coming to b5, or perhaps you were already planning to, after this pawns in the center are traded, you can play b5 and bishop b7, which is a very good plan. Now something interesting happens that has to do with calculation. He plays queen to c2. Remember when I showed you the variation that leads to a isolated queen's pawn for white, then after white retook on c4, I told you that this pawn was sufficiently defended by the queen and the knight. Now the queen has left the d file, and that means that the d4 pawn now can be in trouble. To attack this d4 pawn, we could uncover the d file, and by uncovering the d file I mean that you could here play d takes c4. With d takes c4 we have a new attacker on d4. So if white would retake now with the bishop takes c4, you can take on d4, and then e takes d4, knight takes d4, and it's black the side that has won a pawn here. So this is, by the way, you don't need to be worried about rook to e1 with this pin, because taking on f3 is with check, so that would be a very good thing. That means actually that in this position white cannot retake on d4. He would need to play now rook to d1, preventing you from taking either the knight or the pawn. And you could then support this pawn even more by playing e5. This whole variation is actually based on what changes in the position when the move queen to c2 is played. And that's something that can help you when you have complicated situations you want to calculate. After a move like queen to c2, we can ask ourselves, okay, what changes here in the position? And in this case, the big change, well, actually are two. One of them, of course, is that these two pieces are placed on one diagonal against h7, but the other change is that the queen is not longer defending the d4 pawn. So this idea could lead to the thought, how can I attack the d4 pawn? How can I try to win it? You see, calculating variations is something that is many times based on positional changes in the game. So when something changes, we start trying to see if we can find a way to use this change in our favor. Now in the game here you played the move h6. That is actually not really necessary, I think. I don't think that there was any variation where you needed to fear any bishop takes h7 or any knight to g5. So I think that h6 was a bit too cautious, too slow. Your opponent now made actually a mistake by playing knight to a4. Here again, what changes in the position? There is a knight on a4, and you already had played a6 with the idea of perhaps playing b5. So this again gives us ideas of trying to calculate. We cannot play b5 right now because there is a pawn on c4 that can take on b5. Now how can we get rid of the pawn on c4? Now we get an idea. Now we can say we can play here d takes c4. After bishop takes c4, then b5 wins a piece with this fork. So that would mean that in this position white is in big trouble already. Retreating the bishop, well, it doesn't improve his position at all. Then perhaps we can take on d4, winning this pawn. Remember, the queen is gone from the d file. So what I'm trying to emphasize actually is that every move has a change in the structure of the position, leads to a change, and that can bring us to these ideas of what lines to calculate. And that's something very important in every game, to try to choose what to calculate and what not to calculate, because we are not computers. We cannot calculate every line. But with this way of thinking, thinking about what changes in the position, that can give us the ideas to try to calculate and find the correct variations. Now in this case, what you did is you saw this move and you thought probably he's threatening c5. That's the idea of playing knight to a4, and because of that you played the very logical move b6. But you missed this other idea. But well, b6 is of course a defensive move, supporting c5 very well. And here, in fact, your opponent uses the same idea of uncovering a file to win some material. He uncovers the c file by playing c takes d5, and now it's his queen that is a new attacker against c5. The same idea that we saw that black could do by uncovering the d file and attacking the d4 pawn with the queen, is actually doing it. After e takes d5, he takes on c5, you retake, and now he takes with the knight on c5. So yeah, he won a pawn here. Now in this type of positions, when you are a bit of material behind, it's important to, and that's more, let's say, a psychological part of chess, it's important not to simplify the position too much, but look for muddy waters, look for complications, so you can see if you can find some way to get a compensation or to win back some materials. For example, here, instead of taking the knight, that's what you did, bishop takes c5, simplifying the position. Instead of that, for example, a good idea would be to play bishop to g4, threatening to take this knight, doubling his pawns and weaken his king side, for example. So if white now plays knight to d4 to prevent this, then you could play rook to c8, placing the rook on the same file as his queen and creating some threats of removing this knight from c6, so then you will have two pieces attacking c5. Now, I'm not saying that this will be successful for sure, but it does complicate the position a bit more. So then there are bigger chances that your opponent somewhere misses some line, and you can come back into the game. So the thing that I'm saying, actually the advice that I'm giving you, is that when you are a bit of material behind and you are getting you are standing a bit worse, then don't simplify the position, because an endgame with the pawn less is a very tough thing to play. So try to keep the pieces on the board, complicate the position, so we can try to find some counterplay. Let's see, have a look at the rest of the game. Bishop takes c5, queen takes c5, bishop to b7. Of course, that's a good idea to develop your bishop, make the c8 square available for a rook. He plays here bishop to d2, and you go rook to c8. Absolutely, this must be the best move in the position, activating a new piece, placing it on the same file as the queen. He plays bishop to e2 now, and this bishop to e2, I'm going to repeat it each time. When after every move something important can have changed in the position. So after bishop to e2 we can think, okay, what changes here? The bishop is not longer on this d3, so the e4 square is available now, and you made use of this very well by playing knight to e4 now, attacking the queen, attacking the bishop, and placing this knight on a very beautiful square. White has now less space and you have the initiative. Your rooks are well placed. This looks like you have found now some compensation for this pawn that you are behind. After this, he plays queen to c2, and again you found a very good move here. You played the move knight to d4. Excellent, with double attack on the queen. Here he moved his queen to d3, and at this point you decided to take the bishop on e2 with check. Knight takes e2, and well, I was a bit surprised. Perhaps you already were getting into a bit of time trouble, I don't know, or perhaps later, but I saw here that it's actually not very difficult to see this fork on c2, so I didn't understand why you did not play knight to c2. Knight to c2 is really not that difficult to find. This is a pattern that I'm sure that you have seen many times before. Looking at the level of your play, you must know this type of things. So I wasn't sure what the thought was that made you take on e2. After knight takes e2, then rook takes e2, and now you take the other bishop on d2. Well, perhaps your idea was, I have to get rid of his bishops because he has the pair of bishops, but if we go back in this position, these two bishops are really not worth much. They are not active at all. So we cannot always follow the rules, like if your opponent has a pair of bishops, you have to trade one of the bishops. Many times it's true, but not always. So after taking here, rook takes, and now you take the other bishop. And here there is a rule that says when you trade pieces, try to trade bad pieces for good pieces. And here in fact you are doing the opposite. You are trading a very good knight on e4 for a quite bad bishop at the moment on d2. And I think that giving up this this knight, you're giving up a very important piece. I wouldn't have traded this this knight from e5. Knight takes d2, rook takes d2. Now the pressure starts to increase against d5, but it's at the moment well defended. Queen to f6, knight to d4, rook c7. You want to place your rooks on the c file. It's the only open file, so that's a very logical thing to do. But of course white tries to do the same. Rook c2, rook e to c8, rook to c1, and now something must happen on the c file. These rooks will be traded. Rook takes c2 was your play. He plays rook takes c2, rook takes c2, queen takes c2, and here we see that this knight has become quite strong there on this central square, and we cannot chase it away because you traded your knights and your dark square bishop. And it would be now very handy to have a knight that could be placed, for example, on e6 to trade this strong knight, or to have a dark square bishop to trade this strong knight on d4. So now actually we can say that white controls the dark squares. And this bishop now on b7, because of this blockading knight, this bishop doesn't have any activity. If this knight would not be there, we could eventually look for possibilities of advancing this pawn to get some threats against g2, things like that. But right now it's very difficult for black to play this position. White is standing better here. Queen to b6, b4. White advances his candidate pawn. That's what we call the pawn that doesn't have any other pawn in front. It's the candidate pawn. Queen to d8, h3, queen to c8. Perhaps you now were in time trouble and thought, I want to trade the queens to have more simplicity, more clarity in the position, but actually trading the queens wouldn't help much because of this passive bishop on b7. Queen c5, queen d7, knight f3. Now f6, taking away squares from this knight. That is of course something that's very handy to do, very good to do. On the other hand, it weakens a bit these light squares around your king, but well, let's see what happens. The knight went back to d4 now, because from d4 he can jump to one of these light squares perhaps. King to f7, queen to b6, g6, knight to b3. This knight is going to c5. Queen c6. He doesn't trade here, he plays queen to d4. So white is slowly improving his position more, placing his queen in the center square. Now this knight is going to c5 later. You play queen to c4. He doesn't want to trade and finds here a very powerful move. Queen to a7, pinning this bishop. And it's actually over now. There's no way to save this bishop, because after queen to c8, what you played, then knight to c5 is deadly. So here you resigned, and that's the correct thing to do, because you're going to lose a piece here. And I think this is what you meant about getting into time trouble and making a big mistake, a blunder. Yeah, it's actually missing this pin. That's actually the big mistake. Now I think that white is standing better here, of course. but the game is not over yet. So yeah, we can say that white has good winning chances, but still there are, in practice, you have chances to try something with black, to try to save the game. So if this would be an overboard game, I think no one would resign here with black. We would try to continue and try to find something. But of course, after queen to c4, queen a7, it's all over, right? Now, I was talking in the beginning of the video about exercises to improve these calculating skills, these visualization skills. Well, one of the things that can be done, but it's a bit tough, to do, but you can try, is to play blindfold chess. How do you play blindfold chess? Well, simply by finding a friend who wants to do the same, and then you go for a walk together in the park without the chessboard, chess set, and you simply start playing a game in your mind. The first times that you do this, you will at some point lose the track of the position. Don't worry, it's just an exercise. Another thing that can be done, that can be very useful, is what I actually did in my middle game training videos. Picking a middle game position from a grandmaster game, place that position on the board, and then simply start thinking about this position, what to do, what are plans, and what are possible variations, what are candidate moves. And the variations that you find, you could write them down, and of course you don't touch the pieces. It's all a calculation and visualization exercise. And then after you have thought about, let's say, 15 minutes, then you compare the variations that you found with the rest of the game. So you replay the rest of the game. And in some books, some positions are very well analyzed, so you can compare your variations with the variations of the analysis in the book. Another thing that you can do, sorry, if you don't have a book with the big analyzed games, is that you I'm sorry, I'm having just this this cough. What you can do also is to put this game in a computer, in a chess engine, and then let it calculate. So then you can try the variations that you found and try them out and see if the evaluation of the position by the computer increases or decreases. So then you can see if you found the best moves in the position in the different variations that you were calculating. Those are two very useful exercises. And one main thing that I already mentioned a few times is the thought process, the way you think after your opponent makes a move. Each time ask yourself, what has changed in this position now? Because that can give you ideas, directions, where to look for in variations that you calculate. Alright, well, that's it for now. Thank you very much for sending me this game. I hope you found this video instructive and it will help you to continue successfully your chess adventure. Alright, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.